Huh?
Why not do it once, do it right?
Why's your head in the ground?
I'm going to watch Roundup kill these roots.
Hey, this is Spike's area.
Bob, Roundup can be used where kids and pets will play and breaks down into natural materials. Since Roundup kills the root, what's not coming back, Bob?
The weed?
You betcha, Bob. Come on down and take a peek.
Can I squirt one?
Sure, Bob.
Hello there. I'm Ken Cook, and I'm having another episode, and this is an episode that's happening during Glyphosate Week, which is the end of April, beginning of May, and it's Glyphosate Week for two reasons. There are two major battles that unfolded this week around this weed killer made by Bayer. One major battle took place in the Supreme Court, and that's what we'll focus on with my guest today, Dr. Chuck Benbrook, who is a longtime student and expert in the field of pesticide policy and has also been very deeply involved in some of the court cases that the Supreme Court is considering a measure to overturn. And we'll get into that. It's really directly relevant to a lot of what we've been talking about with respect to how decisions are made on pesticide policy and toxics policy generally, and how the Trump administration has time and again taken the side of pesticide and chemical companies, and this is no exception. But the other thing that happened just this morning, and I'm talking about April 30th, took place in the House of Representatives. There was a move by the House Agriculture Committee in their farm bill. They put a provision in that would have blocked liability for Bayer and other pesticide companies in state court, and would also have taken away some of the ability of states just basically to protect their citizens beyond what EPA does. You may have heard of this flood of litigation against Bayer, formerly known as Monsanto, with respect to this weed killer, glyphosate. Trade name is Roundup. The flood of litigation because thousands and thousands of people have gone to court and claimed that glyphosate contributed to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a kind of blood cancer that many people have come down with. It's not an epidemic, but it's a serious disease that's growing in this country, and glyphosate has been fingered as one of the likely causes. So the House of Representatives weighed in on behalf, at least the House Agriculture Committee weighed in on behalf of Bayer and Monsanto and put this in their farm bill, brought it to the House floor. We'll probably have another session on this topic too. Brought it to the House floor, and it was challenged, first by Democrats, Shelley Pingree and Jim McGovern, then challenged by Shelley Pingree and Thomas Massie, a Republican of Kentucky, and then most notably challenged by Republican Congresswoman Luna from Florida. And she stood up to the Trump administration, to the House Agriculture Committee, to Big Ag, to MAGA, to basically the powers that be in chemical agriculture, and said, no, I am not going to vote and allow a measure in the Farm Bill to block liability for people who want to go to court who believe that Roundup, this chemical, has caused their cancer or other harms. So she stood up an amendment. She got lots of grief from Republican leadership, lots of grief from the Republican-dominated Agriculture Committee that voted overwhelmingly to put this amendment into the Farm Bill against overwhelming opposition from Democrats on the Agriculture Committee. She went to the floor and she got 73 Republicans to vote, along with hundreds of Democrats, to strip this language out of the bill. And the final vote was overwhelmingly a landslide that stripped this Bayer Trump administration big ag provision out of the Farm Bill, so that liability would not be blocked against people who were seeking justice in the courts. So it's an extremely important week in pesticide policy, an extremely important week with respect to the politics around MAHA, which we've been talking about quite a bit. The fundamental question was, can states protect their residents from pesticide harms beyond what federal law might require or the federal agency in charge, EPA, dictates, or will that authority be stripped away? And at least we know now from the vote in the House of Representatives this morning, that will not happen as part of the Farm Bill. So the chemical, again, at the center of all of this is called glyphosate, the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup and other herbicides. And the stakes really couldn't be higher because human lives are at risk. They have been at risk, and human lives have been lost. So before we get into the episode, I want to give some context on two things. What does preemption mean? And what is happening at the Supreme Court? Preemption is a legal doctrine that says when federal law and state law conflict, federal law wins. In the pesticide context, the question is, if the EPA approves a pesticide and sets the language on its warning label, can a state court still hold a company liable for failing to warn consumers about health risks like cancer? Risks that aren't mentioned on that federal label. And EPA is very good about not mentioning on their label when pesticides might be linked to cancer, instead preferring, which is exactly what the pesticide makers prefer, that they make adjustments to how the pesticide might be handled or changes to instructions to farm workers or farmers, put on gloves, change the time when you apply it, don't do it when it's too windy. Soft changes like that rather than just coming right out and saying, hey, this stuff is carcinogenic. Now, Bayer, which acquired Monsanto in a very controversial acquisition some years ago, they argue the answer is no. Since the EPA approved Roundup and didn't require a cancer warning, Bayer says the states have no business second-guessing that through lawsuits or allowing litigation that second-guesses that. This is the preemption argument. Federal regulatory approval essentially shields them from state liability. The case before the Supreme Court involves a plaintiff named John Durnell, one of thousands of people who claim Roundup's active ingredient, glyphosate, caused their non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The Supreme Court asked the Trump administration to weigh in. It sided with Bayer. It said, sure, we'll weigh in. Their message, EPA approved the label, case closed no matter who got sick. A large group of state attorneys general, including some Republicans from red states, disagreed, saying states have always had the right to hold companies accountable through their courts regardless of what a federal label might say. At the same time, as I mentioned, Congress was debating attaching a preemption provision to the Farm Bill, and that was defeated today. Glad to announce that. To walk us through all of this, I'm joined by Dr. Chuck Benbrook, a longtime colleague and one of the foremost experts on pesticide policy in the country, and specifically one of the foremost experts on glyphosate. Chuck has worked on these issues from the halls of Congress to the Carter administration to the National Academy of Sciences, and he served as an expert witness in many of the cases like the ones we're discussing today. Dr. Benbrook recently submitted a formal scientific and legal argument known as an amicus brief to the Supreme Court, urging the justices to preserve the right of states to hold pesticide companies accountable when federal regulators fall short. And boy, do they fall short time and again. There's arguably no better person on the planet to walk us through how we got here, what's really at stake, and why the next few weeks could determine the future of pesticide accountability in this country for a very long time. Not just glyphosate, not just this one pesticide, but the basic ability for people to hold these pesticide companies accountable. Chuck, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining me.
Well, looking forward to it, Ken. But first, thanks for inviting me onto the podcast. It's a great honor. And I think I would be remiss not to share with your listeners the day I first met you. I was working in the new executive office building for the Council on Environmental Quality in the Carter administration. And you were a stringer for the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation.
That's correct.
A young reporter trying to scrape out a living at $25 a piece for an article. And you called me up and said, I understand you're involved in this Resources Conservation Act implementation. That was an issue for you and the Journal. And I said, yes. Well, can I come talk to you? I said, sure. So you set an appointment and you came into the building. And back then they called you upstairs and you came down. So I came down to meet my soon to become very good friend, Ken Cook, and greeted this guy in Birkenstocks without socks, white shorts, and a white T-shirt. I'll never forget it.
Right. That was a official journalistic garb for me back then, and it served me well. I got a lot of scoops in that as I was writing that column for a decade or so. I can't remember. Max Schneff, the great editor of that journal, let me have my way. But yeah, I remember that very well.
It's been a wonderful friendship and a wonderful journey in a lot of ways, and it's kind of a journey that feels like maybe things are turning around a little bit.
Fingers crossed.
But where did all of this tension about glyphosate come from? Well, a couple things that stand out. As you know, and most of your listeners know, glyphosate is a broad spectrum herbicide, and pretty much anything that is green and growing, if you spray it on it, it kills it. So before the advent of genetically engineered crops that were genetically modified to tolerate glyphosate being sprayed on them, farmers could only use glyphosate before their crop came up, or they sprayed it on their crop. They'd kill the weeds and the crop. Or it could be used after the harvest to kind of clean things up and get a field ready for the next year. So the agricultural market for Roundup herbicides, which came on the market in 1974, was quite limited by the very way that the product worked until 1996, the year that the first genetically engineered so-called Roundup Ready crop came on the market, which was Roundup Ready soybeans and Roundup Ready cotton. These new technologies, which required genetically engineering the seed to express a gene that allowed the soybean plant and the cotton plant to go ahead, spray Roundup on me. I'll be just fine.
We love it. We love it.
We love it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That technology, it worked very well, and it came along at a time when farmers were super frustrated and pissed off about all the problems that they were having with weed control. The products on the market at the time, they were having to spray 3 or 4 different ones to control different weeds. There were lots of bad interactions between the herbicides. They were spending more and more money. A lot of the herbicides were persistent in that they carried over. And if the farmers didn't watch it, they'd spray the herbicide and control the weeds in the soybean year of the rotation, but they'd end up screwing up the corn that was planted the next year. So there was a lot of problems with weed management. It wasn't working well, it was complicated, and the costs were going up. So when this Roundup Ready system came along, which couldn't be easier, you just couldn't screw it up. It was such an easy system to do well because you paid the extra money for the seeds that had the trait, and then you plant your Roundup Ready soybeans. And then when the weeds come up, you just spray Roundup and it kills all the weeds.
Yeah, and well into the growing season if you needed to. The corn could be this high, the soybeans, and you could take care of the weeds. It helped farmers a lot. Farmers used to tell me all the time that they couldn't have made their operations bigger, which they wanted to do to generate more revenue. They couldn't have done that if Roundup Ready technology had not come along and made that vital planting operation so much faster and simpler.
So starting in 1996, as this GMO crop revolution unfolded like, a tsunami over American agriculture. It changed EWG. It changed what I was working on. Totally. I got sucked from working on pesticides to working on genetically engineered crops. The foundations moved all their money, as you remember.
Yep.
And the sales of Roundup just took off like a rocket. From 1996 until about 2005 or 6, Roundup moved closer and closer to the most heavily applied pesticide in the country. But around 2005, 2006, it passed atrazine and became number 1.
Another prominent weed killer, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Another corn herbicide, but had some major growth still in it. And it peaked about 2015. And at that point, there was about 3 pounds of glyphosate applied in U.S. agriculture for every pound of atrazine. So not only had it become number 1, but it passed it threefold.
Yeah.
It was by far the most heavily applied pesticide ever in history in the world. Around 2015, there was enough glyphosate applied in the United States to spray 3/4 of a pound of the active ingredient on every cropland acre in the country. And globally, it was about 2/3 of a pound. So you just wrap your mind around it.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever, maybe I've shared this story with you. I talked to an editor from an agricultural trade publication around the 2005, 6, 8 period there, and asked how things were going. And this person said, well, it's pretty tough because we're losing advertisers. And I said, well, why are you losing advertisers? And she said, well, we used to have all these pesticide companies, weed killer companies, buying ads in our magazine, and that kept us afloat. But once Roundup came along and it was so universally used relative to anything else, the ad flow stopped from the other companies because they just kind of gave up. So it even affected journalistic coverage of agriculture and the ability to do that. Incredible.
So I started my work in the pesticide world in 1981 when I took the job as the staff director of the DORFA subcommittee. And at that point, there were 23 pesticide companies that had Washington reps that came and lobbied young staffers like me. 23 of them. And now there's 4 left.
Yeah.
So the concentration in the industry is a huge issue. So the use of glyphosate just took off like a rocket starting in 1996. But not only did the agricultural use go up, but there was continued growth in the lawn and garden, forestry, government arena, industrial arena, because Monsanto recognized that there were lots of other markets where they could sell Roundup, and in particular, the home and lawn and garden market. So people that would buy it at Walmart or Lowe's or Home Depot and spray weeds in their driveway or around the yard or rights of way or plant a garden. So you got to kill the grass before you till the soil. So you spray Roundup. So Monsanto aggressively went after those markets with great success, and they had specially formulated versions of lawn and garden Roundup. And so as the diversity of uses of Roundup expanded incrementally, but over 20 years, there were so many different ways that people were handling the product, spraying the product, and so many different ways that people were being exposed to the product.
I have to remind you here, I was invited by one of the pesticide trade associations to address their annual conference because by the early to mid 1990s, EWG was very much on their radar as a problem in pesticide policy. And I reminded the audience of a Monsanto commercial at the time where someone dressed as if ready to go to the airport, and that was the plot line of the commercial, a TV commercial, leaned out the window of the taxi cab and sprayed Roundup on his driveway and sidewalk to kill the weeds, and then just brought the Roundup bottle back into the cab and off they went. And that's just how safe and easy it was. I don't know if we could ever find that ad, but they pushed it very hard and they brought modern marketing to bear.
Yeah. All throughout this period of when Roundup use was going up, glyphosate use was going up so much, the percentage of the total glyphosate sales represented by ag versus the non-ag market stayed roughly the same, around 10%. The ag went up fast and the non-ag stayed 10%, but it grew because the other was growing.
Yeah.
In the last 20 years, Monsanto has made almost as much profit from the 10% of glyphosate they've sold into the lawn and garden market as the 90% that they've sold to agriculture. So what does that tell you? Well, they're obviously marking up the glyphosate much more. There's a lot of packaging, a lot of promotion. And, somebody goes into Home Depot to buy a gallon of ready-to-use glyphosate. They're not that concerned if it costs $19 or $22. They know it's going to last for quite a while, and they want to control their weeds. So Monsanto has always been able to profit much more significantly from the lawn and garden market, but yet they never did any focused research on the exposure patterns and risks that were unique to that market.
That gets us to Dwayne Lee Johnson, I think, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. So there's two major things that happened that brought glyphosate into the middle of this massive increase in the use and diversification of the ways that it was being used and the ways that we were all exposed to it, including this crazy idea to start spraying it on a wheat crop 2 weeks before harvest.
Yeah.
The so-called pre-harvest use that you and EWG are finally, I think, going to have some success in ending, thank God. That's half of it. And then the other half is that in March of 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization, issued a very unexpected classification of glyphosate and glyphosate-based herbicides, which would include Roundup, as a probable human carcinogen.
Yeah.
This came out of the blue. People, including me, were shocked because we had followed the toxicity data and the EPA's human health risk assessments on glyphosate. And glyphosate looked about as safe as any herbicide that had ever been registered. And now all of a sudden, IARC is saying it's a probable human carcinogen. That's what triggered the interest among tort lawyers out there. And IARC said that the evidence was strongest linking Roundup to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So people that had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and had been using Roundup for 20 years, they said, hey, geez, I wonder if the Roundup contributed to my non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so they talked to a lawyer. Do I have a case? And indeed they did. And Dwayne Lee Johnson, the groundskeeper for the Bonita School District, just a little north of where you live, Ken.
Yeah, that's right.
I believe it was either 6 or 7 school campuses that he was responsible for controlling weeds and other pest control activities. So he probably spent more time spraying Roundup than almost any other specific task in his job. And in his years of doing that, he had 2 very serious exposure episodes where he really got dosed. That's why his non-Hodgkin's lymphoma came on in only 4 years after the exposures. Usually, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma has a longer latency period. But those were the 2 events. The International Agency for Research on Cancer carefully going through the data and explaining why, in their judgment and based on their classification system, the evidence now supports the fact that glyphosate-based herbicides probably cause cancer.
Yeah.
Well, that's what triggered the initiation of the litigation.
That was a case that was brought in state court, right, here in the state of California. The ruling came down in his favor. And for most of these cases where it was in favor of the plaintiff, the initial amounts, the penalties or the settlements that were announced have been reduced by over the course of appeals and reviews and so forth. But it was very substantial. And on top of that, it was pretty clear that there would be many more such cases, and that has turned out to be, in fact, what happened.
Yeah. So the Roundup non-Hodgkin's lymphoma litigation, has dwarfed any past pesticide litigation in the history of the U.S. by multiple orders of magnitude. And in fact, Ken, I think the only mass tort litigation that's involved more overall settlements would be asbestos. I mean, it's
probably. Yeah.
There's been about 110,000 cases that either the vast majority, of course, have settled. There's only been like 32 trials in 11 years. It takes a lot to get through all of the hurdles to actually have a trial. And Bayer-Monsanto has not wanted to go to trial because that's when they're vulnerable to what's called a punitive damage award. So Lee Johnson, he had pretty strong evidence that his massive exposures to Roundup caused his non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And he had actually called the 1-800 number on the bottle to talk to Monsanto physicians after he'd been diagnosed. And he asked them, Is it safe for me to go back and continue to spray Roundup, even though I've been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma? And guess what they said?
Yeah.
No problem, Lee.
Yeah.
Your use of Roundup had nothing to do with your cancer. When they knew that it probably did, the jury was so convinced that Monsanto's behavior was unacceptable.
And that resulted in punitive damages on top of the other damages.
$250 million for
Yeah.
one man.
So you were part of that legal team as an expert witness that
Right.
helped Johnson's legal team succeed in that case. And another person who was part of that legal team is our current Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And he shared in the
Right.
proceeds of the settlement, the share that went to the lawyers. Don't know how they divided it up. It's not been made public. But this was a case that he was integrally involved in. And if you look back at the time, he made some very strong statements, as he's mostly continued to make ever since, about the importance of dealing with the threat that Roundup poses to human health. Not just Mr. Johnson's, God bless him, but lots of other people. And he recruited people as well to bring similar cases, as I understand it, in other venues.
Let's also remember what else was going on at this time. Bayer really wanted to buy Monsanto, either wanted to merge or acquire Monsanto. And that was actually coming to fruition in early 2018. The Lee Johnson trial started, I believe, in March and concluded in May.
Yep.
And the acquisition, the $63 billion check that Bayer wrote to buy Monsanto, occurred right before that trial started. And at the time when Bayer wrote that $63 billion check to buy Monsanto and all of its liability, there were already 4,500 cases had been filed.
Yeah.
So Bayer knew that it was going to be a significant body of litigation. I think it's fair to predict that the Monsanto folks told the Bayer people, oh, this is just BS litigation. The science isn't there. We'll win the first few cases and it'll all go away. I mean, there's no way that Bayer would have gone through with the acquisition unless they did believe that.
You wouldn't think. And back in around right at that time, I had some folks I was talking to with Bayer based in Europe. And if you leave out the Monsanto conversations, Bayer was beginning to take much more seriously developing low risk, organic compliant even pesticides of all kinds of different kinds. They had an investment in a facility here in California to do it that I was proud to view. And the thought that a major player like Bayer would be weighing in a way that would be beneficial because of less toxic, maybe less immediately effective, as is often the case, but less toxic weed killers and other pesticides. And I remember saying to them when I heard that they might be buying Monsanto, I said, look, I don't know all the financial considerations or the market considerations, but what I will tell you is what I mostly know about Monsanto, beyond what I know about what's happened with Roundup, is what they did with PCBs. Because I have a member of my board from Anniston, Alabama, and we worked with him in the years before when Monsanto knew and lied about, hid from their community in Anniston what PCBs were doing to the community of Anniston, particularly a poor community that wasn't entirely African-American, but largely African-American. And my current board member, David Baker, was the guy who pushed back against Monsanto, led the charge in the community, brought Johnny Cochran to town, had thousands of people lined up, and got a huge settlement, the largest settlement at that time, based on fundamentally civil rights law, that they had violated the civil rights of that community. And I think they came in with about a $700 million settlement for the community against Monsanto on PCBs. And I just said, look, if it's in the DNA of a company to not let you know.
Yeah.
And this was always in the backdrop for the two of us, I think, too, with GMO crops, right? This was not the kind of company that was going to step up. Now, most of them don't, but I felt in particular, knowing the PCB history, knowing how much money was at stake in Roundup, I just didn't trust the company. And I said that to these folks I knew at Bayer, but it was higher ups making the decisions. I think it was a bad call, but we'll see how the courts decide.
It's probably worth sharing. Bayer did not buy Monsanto for Roundup.
Right.
They bought Monsanto for the intellectual property methods to genetically engineer seeds. And plus, of course, they got all of Monsanto's seeds. Monsanto, by the time Bayer bought them, had control of much of the base genetics for corn and soybeans in the United States.
Yeah.
That was the real reason that drove Bayer to want to acquire Monsanto, because Monsanto was making a lot of money off of the licensing of the genetic engineering traits to all other seed companies. And when a company has intellectual property like that, that they license to other companies, it's a perpetual cash machine.
Yeah. It's like owning the operating system for American agriculture in a significant way, right? And
Yeah.
look what
Yeah.
that's done for Microsoft and Apple and
Yeah.
others who
Right.
stepped in, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's what Bayer was after. And so the Johnson case happened, and about 6 months later, the Hardeman case. And the
Yes.
Hardeman case was very important because it was the first trial in the federal multi-district litigation, the MDL litigation, run by a very hard-nosed judge named Vince Chabria
Here in San Francisco, the Ninth Circuit, right?
here in San Francisco. And Chabria, to the benefit of Bayer and Monsanto, bifurcated the trial into two parts. The plaintiffs, Hardeman, had to get through the first part to get to the second part of the trial. The first part was just the general causation. Was there adequate science, evidence linking exposure to Roundup and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma to meet the standard of it's more likely than not that Hardeman's exposure to Roundup contributed to his disease, contributed in a significant way.
But where was Hardeman from?
He was from California. I don't remember where in California. He had used Roundup for 20 or 30 years.
On his property.
He wasn't a groundskeeper. He
Yeah.
wasn't a farmer. He had been in good health. And the trial on the first part on the general causation was,
Yeah.
that was Monsanto's and Bayer's best shot at containing the litigation. And the lawyers knew it, both sides, especially because the judge had seemed to be very open to many of the Bayer-Monsanto attorney and expert arguments. Judge Chabria was skeptical about the science.
I was fully expecting the trial to end at that first juncture.
In that first phase of the Hardeman trial, the jury brought back yes, we believe that Roundup contributed to his non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So phase two was liability and Monsanto's bad behavior, and how big should the compensatory damage award be? How big should the punitive damage award be? And then just a few months after Hardeman, the Pilliod case, and the Pilliod case was what really blew it wide open. Alva and Alberta Pilliod. And after he retired from the Navy in good health, they would buy 5 acres of kind of rundown urban, suburban property in Northern California, clean it up. They were birders, so they would each one would take their Roundup sprayer in the evening and walk through the properties and use the Roundup to make trails so they could go and watch the wildlife and the birds. And it's hot in Northern California in the spring and summer. And so they would wear flip-flops or sneakers without socks, shorts and t-shirts, because they'd been told it was safe, and because a lot of the spray solution would land on their lower legs and on their hands. They never got sick. They didn't get a rash. Monsanto had told them it's safe, and they knew they had it on them, and they never got sick, and they never had a rash. So they figured their lived experience was aligned with what Monsanto was saying. But Doc, there's a problem. When a chemical damages your DNA, you don't feel it.
Yeah.
You don't get a rash.
They were from Livermore, so they were out in the heat of the day.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And if you've been to Livermore, you know how hot it gets over there. But yeah, and it got into their skin. And so what happened next?
Alva and Alberta Pilliod, married couple, they got exactly the same type, the major type of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma within like 6 months of each other. So they got the same disease.
Oh.
And the lawyer that presented the case, Brent Wisner, someone that you've met.
Yeah.
He did a masterful job at the tail end of the case in presenting to the jury a way for them, if they so choose to impose punitive damages, how might they figure out the number? 1 million, 10 million? And he brought to their attention multiple times during the trial an email sent by medical doctor to the rest of the management team, the senior people involved in preserving their markets for Roundup. And this email chain was speculating about the impact of the IARC classification as a probable human carcinogen.
Big problem for Monsanto. Big problem.
And whether the IARC report would change the EPA's mind so that they said, no, the EPA position was it was not likely to pose cancer. And they were concerned about the IARC decision pushing EPA to at least go to possible carcinogen or maybe to a probable carcinogen, which is what the classification decision that IARC made. So this medical officer wrote an email to the brass speculating about whether the IARC classification would change EPA, and he entitled it The $1 Billion Question.
There you go.
And Brent, in the end of his closing statement, this is right before basically the case goes to the jury, he brought that email back to the attention of the jury in a way that some of the jurors said, billion, that's okay. Well, guess what the jury awarded? $1 billion to both Alva and Alberta. So it's a $2 billion punitive damage award, one of the largest punitive damage awards in history for two people.
For anything. Yeah. It's this internal document, right? This secret stuff, what they knew and when they knew it. Profound impact, right? You could line up all the animal studies and all the rest of the evidence, critically important to take that into account. But there's something about corporate malfeasance, doing things dishonestly, that really rubs a juror wrong.
So there were two other smoking gun, very impactful emails in all of these early trials. The second one was an email by Donna Farmer sent to colleagues in Australia who were dealing with a major news program, investigative program, doing a story about does Roundup cause cancer? And they were getting advice from the brass in St. Louis about what they should say to the reporter. They had drafted a statement saying, oh, Roundup doesn't cause cancer, blah, blah, blah. And she sends them an email saying, we can't say Roundup doesn't cause cancer because we haven't done the studies required to make that statement. Write in an email. Well, so the jury sees that email about 5 times.
I remember that very well.
During the trial. And then my personal favorite, number 3.
I think I know which one this is, but go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, you know what's coming. It was written by a senior scientist working for Monsanto Europe that had been involved with the very successful re-registration process in Europe, where the European regulators had basically told Monsanto Europe that they're going to ban Roundup with polyethoxylated tallowamine, POA surfactants, because it was genotoxic. It was clearly damaging DNA.
The surfactants are the things they add to the formulation to aid in its efficacy on the leaf of the plant, right?
Correct. but it
Yep.
also speeds up the movement of the glyphosate through skin. And it
Yes.
also speeds up the glyphosate moving through a hematopoietic stem cell wall, because the glyphosate's got to get inside the cell to come into contact with the DNA to trigger the mutation that starts that cell on the path to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma or leukemia or multiple myeloma, which are things that your buddy Benbrook
Yeah.
learned through 11 years working on this
Yeah.
litigation. So this guy that helped Monsanto do this seamless transition where they voluntarily took all of the Roundup off the market that they were selling in Europe that was formulated with the POEA surfactants and replaced it with Roundup formulated with another surfactant, quaternary ammonia surfactants. And it worked fine. They didn't lose any market. There was no big public concern. And so Dr. Richard Garnett, the guy that did this, was involved in a debate with the brass in St. Louis, the senior people who were trying to figure out what to do next, because they were dealing with re-registration in the US.
Yeah.
They were dealing with concerns in Mexico that wanted to end use of Roundup. Garnett and others put on the table, well, why don't we make the same change worldwide that we made to make Roundup safer in Europe?
Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you?
Why wouldn't you? And so in the course of this long email chain with, the senior people, the key people that were the
That was
decision
never
makers,
meant to be public.
that was never meant to be public. This guy puts in a line, why should we keep making a hazardous pesticide when we know how to make a safer one?
Yeah.
In the email.
I remember.
And so again, the jury saw that like 5 times over the weeks of the trial. I mean, what could be a clear admission that they understood that there were risks to the old Roundup, the Roundup that's still being sold to American farmers, by the way.
Yeah. Again, that, when will anyone learn, if they haven't learned it already, that the cover-up is worse than the crime?
Yeah. And that's when the advertising started all over the country. I mean, how many ads did all of us, on the radio, on the TV, billboards, if you used a lot of Roundup, call this number. And then, of course, the number of cases filed, ballooned from several thousand to 100,000. And now I think the total it's pushing 180,000 total.
Yeah.
There's still new cases coming in. It's one of the things that, we ought to talk about a little bit, is that there's absolutely no change in how Bayer-Monsanto has dealt with Roundup, other than for the lawn and garden market. They took the relatively low tox active ingredient glyphosate out of it and put in 3 or 4 different herbicides, including most of them that are much more toxic than glyphosate, which is it's such an irresponsible action by this company. And they say, oh, we did it because we have to curtail the liability risk. Well, there's going to be a lot of people that are harmed by this new Roundup because it's still called Roundup.
Yeah.
People don't know that there's 4 other pesticides in it. And they think, well, I used to get it all over me and it never made me sick. Well, you get this stuff all over you and
we'll see.
You are going to get, you are going to get sick. Other than that, they've done nothing.
Yeah. And they could have, as they said themselves. So let's talk through the case that proceeded, that your amicus brief filed on behalf of Heartland Health and Research Alliance, HHRA. The Trump administration came in the Ninth Circuit and said, yes, we want the Supreme Court to hear it. And yes, FIFRA preempts, the federal law preempts the states being able to have any kind of parallel warning that should be made known to anyone who uses the product. So that case just kind of dies out because the Biden administration comes along and says, no, we think FIFRA preemption here is not appropriate. So Hardeman gets their settlement, and then Mr. Durnell comes along. And at this point, we have the Department of Justice under Biden is still saying, no, we don't think the Supreme Court should intervene. We don't think you should look at this case because it's settled. Preemption doesn't prevent these kinds of plaintiffs' cases from coming forward. But the new Supreme Court, as of the summer of 2025, asked the new Trump administration, been in office not even a year, asked them, what should we do? Should we take another look? Because maybe things have changed with the new administration. And sure enough, then that's when the Trump administration, for the second time, in the case that's going to the Supreme Court, the Trump administration says the same thing in effect that it said before. Yeah, these cases should be thrown out because FIFRA protects the companies.
I learned from a very reliable source that this issue of preemption and the tension within the MAHA world came up several months ago in a cabinet meeting that Trump was at. And he said, what's this about? And somebody that knew a little bit about it said, oh, it's this preemption thing. And Trump said, we shouldn't agree with that. We don't want to give a free pass to chemical companies. He said that. And at the time, it wasn't expected, but the view was, well, it looks like the White House wasn't gonna weigh in on behalf of Bayer and Syngenta in this policy fight. But clearly other voices changed his mind.
Yeah, and my colleague, also Brian Bienkowski for the new lead, works with Kerry Gillum. He just won the North American Agricultural Journalist's top award for news because of his study using the Freedom of Information Act to unearth just how many times Bayer-Monsanto lobbyists met with the administration to argue for them to come home and stand for the companies and not for the victims of this exposure.
Oh my God, the degree to which Bayer and former Bayer people and people whose professional careers and livelihood has been dependent on Bayer and the other pesticide companies, I've never seen anything like it, from the Secretary of Agriculture, Susie Wiles, the Chief of Staff, this major fundraiser, Brandon somebody, the Florida guy.
Yeah.
They all have deep ties into Bayer. This is how large corporations engage with government.
It's how they get their way.
They establish long-term relationships with people of influence that they don't know exactly. I mean, who would have guessed that Brooke Rollins would be Secretary of Agriculture in 2026?
No one in agriculture guessed it.
No, nobody in agriculture. And, I think, Brooke is doing a fine job on some issues, but she certainly is paying attention to her friends and colleagues in the Bayer world. And the degree of influence that Bayer has now on this administration, I've never seen anything like it.
It's shocking. And, of course, Lee Zeldin responded pretty favorably when the attorneys general early in the administration came to him and said, here's our petition to you at EPA to intervene on behalf of Bayer and Monsanto and stand up for preemption of state law. I think all of us were blown away by the executive order that invoked national security as yet another layer of defense. So let's think about the layers here. First of all, there's the proceedings in federal court where the Solicitor General, the top trial lawyer for the Justice Department, weighed in on behalf of Bayer and Monsanto. Then you have this executive order that, hey, it's a matter of national defense that we keep this stuff being produced. And then finally, we haven't yet heard what the administration will say, but I don't think it'll be a surprise. There's an effort in Congress to rewrite the law in favor of Bayer and Monsanto and lots of other pesticide companies to choke off any kind of state-based claims of harm and avenues for accountability. So that's really pretty impressive. We probably won't get to the prospect that a bad decision at the court or the passage of this bad amendment in the Farm Bill, the implications it will have for other pesticide litigation and other venues for holding pesticide companies accountable, but it's significant, right?
Yeah. You asked about the Durnell case.
Yeah.
John Durnell was a very typical urban user of Roundup, bought it at local Lowe's or Home Depot, sprayed it around his yard, again for several years, and was exposed to enough of it that the amount of damage to the DNA in these hematopoietic stem cells in his bone marrow, it created enough mutated cells that our incredibly elaborate and redundant immune systems just couldn't keep up.
Yeah.
And sometimes a cancer will get ahead of the immune system when the immune system's fighting a urinary tract infection or an ear infection or
Yeah.
upper respiratory infection. Or sometimes people are put on immunosuppressive drugs because they're having an organ transplant. If there's some cancer cells in that person's body, they're going to go wild. So cancer is such a complicated disease, and there's essentially never or hardly ever one thing that causes a
Yeah.
case of cancer. It's a series of things that unfold over at least a few years, and timing has a lot to do with it. John Durnell's case, which I was involved with, I did an expert report and was deposed as part of the case. I didn't testify at trial. It reached a judgment. I think he was awarded $1.25 million, which was definitely on the low side.
Yeah.
Monsanto didn't pick the Durnell case because of the large award. There were other reasons that they felt it would be a good vehicle to get these issues back in front of the Supreme Court. So when Bayer-Monsanto literally engineered the conflict between the appeals courts, they paid people to do the appeals and rewarded either plaintiffs or attorneys for an outcome in those appeals that set up the request for the Supreme Court to take the case.
Set up by a split between two districts.
Three.
The third, three? Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah,
I know
yeah.
it's the one in Philadelphia, obviously the one in California. And then where was the third one?
It's in the Southeast.
Okay. The Supreme Court's looking at it and saying, hey, we're getting conflicting readings
Right.
from the courts right below us. So that's an invitation for us to step in.
Right. But one of the reasons this is so controversial within the legal community is that Bayer-Monsanto paid for lawyers to create the conflict in a way that's been exposed.
How did they go about it? How did they do it?
What it boiled down to is that they promised both the attorneys and the person that was the plaintiff in the litigation that they would receive financial compensation, even if they settled their case. But
Wow.
so once the Supreme Court decided to take the case, I said to myself, I've been dealing with preemption since 1981, when I served as the staff director of the Dorfus subcommittee. And the number one issue that the industry wanted changes on in 1981 in George Brown's subcommittee was preemption. And
Yeah.
why? Because the state of California, Florida, Massachusetts, and New York were starting to impose further restrictions, mostly on insecticide use, because they didn't want farm workers to be poisoned in the
Yeah.
field.
These were parallel to what was required on the label, right?
Correct.
Not additional to or substitutes to. They were just parallel. Like you have to do this too under state law.
Yeah. Let's use wine grapes. A lot of insecticides are used in wine grapes. And the company gets a federal label that it says how much can be applied, how many times, what kind of sprayer, what sort of PPE the applicator has to wear.
Personal protective equipment.
But doesn't say much about a farm worker, maybe in the next field over, or a farm worker that's
Who
going
gets
into
drift
prune the
on
grapes.
them. Who
Yeah.
it drifts onto them or whatever. A family. Could be anybody.
And the federal label doesn't have any warnings about if you're working in and around a treated field, make sure that you don't get exposed, because this stuff will kill you.
Yeah.
Federal labels were being approved that did not address in any way, shape, or form many of the ways that farm workers were getting inadvertently, accidentally exposed in places like California, where you'd have a heavily sprayed grape field next to a strawberry field, next to a cauliflower field.
Yeah.
And, they're close enough together that some of the pesticides drift, and people were getting badly injured. Some people were being killed. So the states were requiring on state labels additional restrictions on when and where a field could be applied. And for example, the state of California wanted to put a sign on the corner of the field. This has been sprayed, stay out of the field for at least 24 hours. And they
Yeah.
wanted the signs to be in Spanish. What
course.
a radical idea,
Of course.
right? And this is what the pesticide industry at the national level, they didn't want states to be free to address these very localized and often really dangerous high risk exposure scenarios. So they came to our subcommittee and said, we want to cut back the role of states in pesticide labeling, and states can't require anything more on their label than what the federal EPA did. And if a farm worker is injured and heaven forbid killed, they can't go into a state court and sue the company because they got sprayed from this application on the grapes and were exposed to enough to kill them. They couldn't bring litigation because the application was complied with what was on the federal label. So what California was doing, they were adding additional requirements, including mandatory warnings.
Yeah.
And so now the industry says the argument behind the current effort is that a farmer or a farm worker or someone that is exposed to a pesticide in a state and is harmed, either harmed economically, the pesticide killed their crop, killed their apple trees, damaged the paint on their Maserati, which was happening from some aerial applications in California, remember?
Yeah, I do remember that.
You know, people were being harmed from legal labeled uses of pesticides. And because of state law, they would go into court and say there was a failure to warn. But the pesticide companies want now the federal court system and the Supreme Court to say to the state court, you can't recognize a failure to warn claim unless the warning was on the federal label.
Yeah.
And of course, pesticide companies, they're responsible for writing the labels, and they resist.
They don't want to do it.
They don't want to do it.
It'll hurt sales. It'll hurt
It'll hurt
sales.
sales, yeah.
Yeah, you have a phrase in your brief, industry backed by the Trump administration. I'm going to say it again, backed by the administration that includes Bobby Kennedy. What they're basically saying is we want to make sure that this preemption exists not just for the things we warn about on the label, but for anything we didn't think of
or didn't understand.
Didn't understand. No science.
Yeah.
But the states are producing the science. Heartland Health and Research Alliance produced vital information, new science that wasn't originally considered in the registration of the pesticide you write about in the brief. But there we are.
Let me just briefly describe part of the HHRA amicus brief that I think's going to catch the attention of the Supreme Court.
Fingers crossed.
At the core of it, the pesticide industry, Bayer-Monsanto, want to take states out of the pesticide regulatory business.
Out of the game.
Well,
totally.
Out of the game. What's going on right now involving another major Monsanto herbicide called dicamba? Dicamba is one of the herbicides that Monsanto has developed a way to genetically alter soybeans and cotton plants so that not only can you spray glyphosate over the top of the crop, but you can also spray dicamba. And dicamba is very helpful in dealing with some of the difficult to control broadleaf weeds that are really plaguing corn and soybean farmers around the country now.
And that because Roundup no longer works, right?
Because it was used too heavily and
Yeah.
irresponsibly. Because Monsanto fought putting any kind of resistance management provisions on the label because they were afraid that it might curtail their sales.
Yeah.
Because Monsanto is all about maximizing the sale and profits from its products. And anything that gets in the way of that, what they call they want to preserve the freedom to operate, the freedom to get labels, and then to prevent any limitations being put on the existing labels.
Freedom to operate. I can see the bald eagles in the American flag, unless the
Yeah.
pesticide has killed the bald eagles, of course. But I can see the
Yeah.
bald eagles in the American flag in the background. Yeah, freedom. Freedom to
So
operate.
dicamba's been a hugely controversial development, these dicamba tolerant crops, because dicamba is very volatile. So farmers would spray dicamba and kill the broadleaf weeds in the soybean field, but then the dicamba, it volatilizes and goes up in the air, and then it moves with the wind, and wherever it next rains or a little dew, it's going to come back down to earth. Well, guess what? There's a lot of plants and trees and shrubs that when that dicamba comes back down to earth, it's going to harm it, if not kill it. So all over the Midwest, there's been this movement of dicamba and another phenoxy herbicide, 2,4-D, which is also very volatile. So the herbicides, they don't stay on the field where they sprayed,
Funny
especially
thing.
in hot and humid
Yeah.
weather. They volatilize, go up in the air, and move. And so this has just created havoc in these Midwestern and Southeastern states where there's a lot of genetically engineered soybeans and cotton grown and a lot of dicamba being applied. So what have the states done? The states all now do supplemental labels. And what's in the supplemental labels? They have things like you can't apply dicamba after June 15th north of Highway 5 or in X County.
Yeah.
So all of the states now are doing supplemental labels for the dicamba product that's registered for over-the-top use in association with the genetically engineered soybeans and cotton. And these labels have some combination of geographic restrictions, where they can be sprayed, and what the cutoff date is, because this volatilization problem, it gets worse as it gets hotter. So
Yeah.
the farther into the summer, the worse the problem is. From the first year it was used when they could use it, Christ, they could apply it in August, and they were having huge problems. Now, most of the states don't allow it much after the third week in June. And basically, the farther south you go, the earlier that date is.
Yeah.
So now there are 3 companies, Bayer-Monsanto, Syngenta, and BASF, that have EPA-approved dicamba labels for applications on genetically engineered soybeans and cotton. These products are now approved in 34 states. So do the math.
Yeah.
34 times 3. So now states are reviewing and approving 100 supplemental labels. 100 supplemental labels. These are labels that the states have to do, have to apply, they have to enforce, and there's all kinds of crazy ass implications that nobody thought of. You know, somebody's farming in Missouri along the Iowa border, and they go and they buy some dicamba in Iowa, and it's got the label for Iowa, and they bring it to Missouri. Who's at fault?
Yeah.
It's unimaginable.
One of the dynamics here, and you brought it to my attention as these cases were unfolding, in this instance, this is a farmer versus farmer thing, right? This is where the plaintiffs were the farmers who were complaining that the drift of this dicamba into their fields that weren't dicamba resistant was costing them a lot of money, a lot of damage, and very upsetting. Much as they care about their neighbors, they want their neighbors to be able to do what they want to do, like they want to do with their own land. But this stuff doesn't stay on your land. It doesn't stay on your crops. It moves.
Just think of the hypocrisy here where Bayer-Monsanto, for its Roundup product, is saying, we got to cut the role of states out because we don't like the fact that sometimes we get hauled into court and maybe have to compensate somebody that's been harmed by our product. But for our dicamba product, oh, we like it that the states are doing like almost 100 supplemental labels this year to allow farmers to spray dicamba on genetically engineered soybeans and cotton.
And then it falls on the farmers. If they haven't obeyed the label, it falls on them, not on Monsanto. Is that right?
Well, yes, that is exactly correct. Now, if Monsanto has written a inaccurate or ineffective or ambiguous label, they also can become part of litigation. But the thing that just boils my blood about this, Ken, is the current Supreme Court precedents and direction to state courts about when somebody that is defending a Monsanto or a Syngenta in state court, somebody has Parkinson's disease, somebody has non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and has brought suit, and that person is seeking compensation from the company, the instructions to the judge on how to deal with emotion, to throw out the failure to warn cause of action, the basis of the litigation.
Yeah.
Throw it out. You can't do it. That foundation, that interpretation of the FIFRA law was put in place in 2005 as a result of a bunch of cantankerous Texas peanut farmers.
Yes.
These peanut farmers had bought a brand new Dow AgroSciences herbicide, dichlorsuram. The trade name was Strong Arm. Strong Arm. Right?
They always have the great trade names, Machete and whatever. Yeah.
But there was one issue with Strong Arm, maybe more than one, but one issue that Dow knew about was that in soils, high pH soils, it didn't break down as fast as it normally did, and it was pretty persistent. So if a peanut farmer used it in the peanuts, it would work great. It would control the weeds. But then the farmer plants a cotton crop after the peanuts, the next year, and holy shit, the Strong Arm herbicide is still active and damages the subsequent crop. Well, that's what happened to this group of, I think there was 7 or 8 plaintiffs, led by the lead plaintiff was a farmer named Bates. And all they asked for was their losses to be covered, which is the amount of money that they paid to plant the subsequent crop. And this kind of thing with, carryover herbicide damage, it was happening regularly all over the country. And most of the time, if it was a custom applicator, they would have insurance, and the insurance would more than cover it. And sometimes the companies would kick in some of the money if it was a larger, broader adverse impact. But for some reason, Dow decided that, by God, we're going to fight this and try to get rid of this failure to warn cause of action. And so Dow takes on this group of 7 Texas peanut farmers, takes on big Dow AgroSciences.
All the way to the Supreme Court. Yeah.
And wins. And wins. And so now American farmers read the propaganda put out by the Modern Ag Alliance and other front groups that are being financed mostly by Bayer-Monsanto and Syngenta, that are the 2 multinational pesticide companies facing billions of dollars of costs from litigation over, in the case of Syngenta, paraquat and Parkinson's disease, and in the case of Bayer-Monsanto, Roundup and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. They are desperate to find a way to limit their liability exposure. And let me at this point make one other point that is really important. Why is the pesticide industry so determined to try to get this change in law put in place? And there's really a very obvious answer. Science is catching up with the ability to link exposure to a given pesticide to damage to DNA or some marker of the evolution of a chronic disease, which then clearly increases the risk of some bad thing happening. Science is catching up on all of the instances where the pesticide industry covered up knowledge and evidence of harm and convinced regulators to say, yep, it's okay. We'll label that. That pesticide can be in broccoli. This pesticide can be in carrots. This pesticide can be sprayed all over rangeland in the West. And EPA made those decisions because the companies had successfully kept the regulators from understanding what the companies already understood about how the pesticide can damage human health. And the companies know that there are going to be more of these successful efforts by the pesticide industry to keep products on the market for decades, in some cases, after the company knew it was causing significantly heightened risk of, in the case of paraquat and Parkinson's disease, the predecessor companies to Syngenta, remember back in the day when we called them Novartis?
Okay, I do remember, yeah.
Yeah, well, we're going back. But in the 1980s, Novartis sponsored cutting-edge quality research on what paraquat was doing in the human brain. And guess what they found? It was triggering damage to dopaminergic neurons, completely consistent and fundamentally part of the progression of damaged neurons to Parkinson's disease in the 80s.
Yeah, and another shout out to Carrie Gillum, because she published something called the Paraquat Papers. They're on the New Lead website right now. They were published by The Guardian as well. That again, once you lift this corporate veil and see what they knew and when they knew it, what they were talking about in memos and emails and other communications, they frickin' knew. And they have an obligation under law to let the government know, and they didn't. And we know why they didn't, for all the reasons you just described. It's the beginning of the end for them.
And Ken, let me make really clear, because I'm sure some farmers that do worry about access to Roundup are listening to this. Monsanto knew that Roundup herbicides were damaging the DNA in stem cells in all of our bone marrow. They knew that by the early 2000s. They didn't have any tools to quantify exactly how big the increase in risk of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, multiple myeloma, leukemia, the blood cancers, very important cancers. They didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle put together like we do now, today.
Yeah.
But they knew enough to say, let's put a warning on.
Yeah.
If you're using this product a lot and use it over several years, take extra precautions to avoid exposures. They should have put a requirement for on the label.
Yeah.
When you are handling and applying this product, wear gloves. I mean, how simple is that?
How about a long sleeve shirt? How about
a
long pants?
sleeve?
No flip-flops. Right.
No flip-flops. Yeah. The Roundup non-Hodgkin's lymphoma litigation is unfortunately stuffed with incredible stories. There was a woman in Florida. She loved her backyard garden, especially her rose bushes. She had an area in her backyard with her rose bushes.
My mom and Aunt Ruth did too. I think you saw it one time.
God bless them.
Yeah, that's right.
Been a long time since they left us, Doc.
That's right.
So this woman, she used bark mulch under her roses. She was very proud of her roses. And then she had her lawn, and she hated it when her lawn started to creep out into her bark mulch, which
don't we all?
tend to do.
Don't we all? Yeah.
So she devised a creative solution. She would have her little Roundup canister that she bought at Home Depot and the little electric sprayer on with shorts on and bare feet.
Yeah.
And she would put her foot on top of the edge of the grass, and then spray the bark mulch with her foot catching the spray. And she did that for several years. And guess what? She got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Yeah.
I mean, people do kind of
Yeah.
crazy things. But
Yeah.
when a company tells people that their product is non-toxic, it's all natural ingredients,
You
it's
can spray it
biodegradable.
out the window of a cab as you're on your way to the
Right.
airport.
Right.
Yeah.
And remember the ads for DDT with the kids in suburban
Yes,
areas
of course.
walking behind the spray truck because it looks like it's snowing in an urban area?
I did it in my suburban
did
St.
it.
Louis neighborhood. Of course I did.
Yeah.
Of course I did.
So
We all did.
what does DDT and Roundup, glyphosate, have in common? They have an extraordinarily high LD50.
The LD50 is the amount that will kill half the animals in an experiment.
Exactly. LD stands for lethal dose, dash 50 is 50% of the animals. So this is the
Die during the
standard-
study.
Yeah, right.
It's not like
Yeah.
this is, we wait around for them to get cancer. They're freaking dead
Right.
in the cage.
Right. Right. And so, the LD50 for glyphosate is like 4,000 parts per million. I mean, it's really high. Just the same as with DDT. I mean, you can stick your arm into a barrel of Roundup and pull your arm out, and you're not going to get sick. You're not going to have symptoms. You're not going to get a rash. If you stick your little one finger just a little bit into that much paraquat, you're going to die.
Yeah.
Or any of the high risk organophosphate or carbamate insecticides.
Yeah. Yeah. It varies. Well, you've been very generous with your time. So I just want to ask you one more question. And you know, again, this is going to stay with us for a while, especially depending on where the Supreme Court goes down, depending on what happens with the Farm Bill next week. And we don't have time to talk about that particular scenario, but you and I have been through dozens of farm bills, it feels like. But what do you think is at stake now? So politically, there are all kinds of questions now in the world of Maha because they feel betrayed, and rightly so. They shouldn't have been surprised, but because they don't know all the history that we know, they just assume when Trump said he was going to do something about pesticides, and it sounds like you've heard he was surprised at the preemption position the government took in the end too. So there's that political element where we got to get people to wake up to what's really going on. But then there's the real possibility that if this decision goes the wrong way, and we've had some doozies on the environment from this court, right? That we could really be in trouble. We could really lose one of our few remaining avenues other than buying organic food, but certainly for a lot of people being exposed outside the dietary exposure route, we could really be in trouble when it comes to protecting human health and the environment and all kinds of critters from pesticides. But what's your sort of closing thought on all of this, Chuck? You and I go back decades, but you've been, a leader on pesticide policy and regulation, and obviously deeply involved as an expert in this litigation now, also for decades. What comes to your mind that makes you most concerned if this goes sideways?
Really important question, Ken. And I think the answer is that right now, the only meaningful accountability and concern about coming forward and getting high-risk pesticides registered for uses that are going to result in a lot of human exposure is the risk of litigation. If that risk is taken away, then right now the pesticide industry has a very cozy relationship with the Office of Pesticide Programs.
Long-standing, very long, unfortunately, uncomfortably long-standing, I think. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
OPP started to go downhill by the late 80s. And from basically the late 80s on, the ability of pesticide registrants to get their way with the Office of Pesticide Programs has steadily increased to the point now where they're not really that concerned about getting their products on the market, and they're certainly not concerned about EPA taking a high risk product off the market. I mean, look what happened just 2 weeks ago. Syngenta bailed on paraquat before the EPA took it off the market.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
why did Syngenta bail on it? Because they know they're going to keep getting sued, that it's been banned in China, which owns Syngenta. It's just the lax approach of the US EPA and the Office of Pesticide Programs about well-documented, clearly hazardous uses of pesticides. It's a travesty. And I think that farmers are starting to figure it out because they look in their neighborhood. Cancer, this family, 2 cases of cancer, this family, 3 cases in this family.
Yeah.
They can see that people are getting sick.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we have big problems with how we grow food in this country and then what we do with the food between when it leaves the farm and people eat it. The concerns over ultra-processed food are real. The health of the American public is a national disgrace right now.
Yeah, for sure.
I think the public is about had it with it.
Yeah.
And I think that the day's going to come, in the next 5 or 10 years where there's going to be substantial changes in some of the laws and policies that govern agriculture and food safety and food quality. We could have the most nutritious, delicious, diverse food supply in this country if we wanted to. But no, what do we have? We produce a lot of ethanol.
Yep.
We export a lot of food, and we feed a lot of corn and soybeans to livestock and create unhealthy fats that keep us unhealthy. Our food and fiber system is seriously broken, and the time has come to fix it.
Well, between your lips and God's ears, Brother Chuck, I'm going to end there and thank you for explaining all of this to me and to my audience, and also for your decades of devotion intellectually and devotion that comes from the heart. I know that firsthand. We'll come back when we find out how some of these big decisions have come down. The most momentous decisions really since the mid-1990s Food Quality Protection Act and the National Academy. Most momentous
I knew you were going to say that at some point.
Yeah, we haven't had a moment like this.
Yeah.
And we'll stick with it. Chuck Benbrook, thank you for joining and giving me another great episode.
Thank you.
Thank you to Dr. Chuck Benbrook for joining me today. And thank you out there for listening. If you'd like to learn more, be sure to check out our show notes for additional links to take a deeper dive into today's discussion. Make sure to follow our show on Instagram at Ken Cook's Podcast. And if you're interested in learning more about EWG, head on over to ewg.org or check out the EWG Instagram account at Environmental Working Group. Now, if this episode resonated with you, and I hope it did, and you think someone you know would benefit from it, send it along. The best way to make positive change is to start as a community with your community. Today's episode was produced by the extremely remarkable Beth Rowe and Mary Kelly. Our show's theme music is by Moby. Thank you, Moby. And thank you again out there for listening.